in the heart of Tang Dynasty China, amidst the constant hum of politics, warfare, and imperial ambition, lived a woman whose name would not be etched in the annals of history with the same recognition as emperors or generals. Yet her role in shaping the life of one of the dynasty's most formidable military leaders would prove indispensable. This is the story of Zhang Shi, the wife of Han Guo Gong, whose wisdom, loyalty, and quiet strength helped guide her husband, the famed general, through one of the most tumultuous periods in Chinese history. The Tang Dynasty, founded in 618 AD, was a time of great expansion, cultural flourishing, and relentless military struggle. But behind the banners of war and the triumphs of generals, there were quieter figures, those who, though not always remembered by history, were pivotal in the success and survival of the empire. Zhang Shi was one such figure. Her life would span the rise of a warrior destined for greatness, her own unwavering dedication to him, and the complex, often dangerous world of court politics. Born in the early years of the Tang Dynasty, Zhang Shi was the daughter of a minor but respected family from the capital city of Chang'an. While little is known about her early life, the stories that would be passed down focused on her calm demeanor, intelligence, and ability to navigate the complexities of the world around her. In a time when women were largely defined by their familial roles, Zhang Shi would rise to become something far more, an unseen force behind a legendary man. The sun hung low in the sky over Chang'an, the capital of the Tang Dynasty, casting long shadows over the bustling streets. The city was a mosaic of cultures, a thriving metropolis where scholars, merchants, soldiers, and artisans from across the empire mingled under the protective gaze of the imperial palace. It was here, in the heart of this vibrant world, that Zhang Shi was born, though at the time, her name was not one of the great figures of history. No one would have predicted that this quiet, thoughtful girl would one day become the cornerstone of a dynasty's greatest general. Zhang Shi was the only daughter of a respected but unremarkable family of scholars. Her father, Zhang Kai, was a well-versed scribe known for his eloquent writings and deep knowledge of Confucian texts. Her mother, Lu Mei, was a gracious woman with a keen sense of diplomacy. The couple had only one child, and they devoted themselves to Zhang Shi's education, hoping that she might one day use her talents to navigate the complex world of the imperial court. In a society where women were often seen as vessels of marriage and motherhood, Zhang Shi's parents broke from convention by encouraging her intellect and independent thought. As a child, Zhang Shi showed remarkable curiosity. Her mind was sharp, absorbing the philosophical discussions between her father and his scholarly friends. Though she was a girl, her father often entrusted her with reading the classics and discussing them with him over evening tea. This was unusual in a society where women were often not given the same educational opportunities as men. But her father was different. He recognized the rare intellect in his daughter and nurtured it. At the age of 12, Zhang Shi was already fluent in the Confucian texts and had begun to read the histories of ancient China. She had a particular fascination with the stories of the generals and statesmen who had shaped China's destiny. Figures like Cao Cao, Zhuge Liang, and the legendary generals of the Han Dynasty. Zhang Shi's mind was keenly attuned to the strategic thinking that shaped the fates of empires, and she often found herself contemplating what it meant to be both a scholar and a warrior. Though she would never wield a sword, she understood that the power of knowledge could shape history as much as the might of armies. It was during these formative years that Zhang Shi first heard of Han Lam, the rising star in the Tang military, a general in his early 30s. Han Lam was known throughout the empire for his military genius and unwavering loyalty to the emperor. He had earned the title of Han Guo Gong, Prince of Han, after his decisive victories against the northern tribes, cementing his place as one of the most respected military leaders in the empire. Zhang Shi had heard whispers of his exploits at the marketplace and at court, but she did not yet know how deeply her life would become intertwined with his. One afternoon, while Zhang Shi was helping her father organize his scrolls, Her mother entered the room with a note from a distant relative. The letter was an invitation to a banquet at the home of a prominent noble family, where a great number of important figures were expected to gather. Zhang Shi's parents, seeing the opportunity to expand their social circle, decided to accept the invitation. Little did Zhang Shi know, this banquet would be the event that set the course of her life on an entirely new path. The banquet was held in a grand hall, filled with the chatter of scholars, poets, military officers, and politicians. Zhang Shi felt out of place at first, her quiet nature contrasting with the bustling energy of the room. However, as the evening wore on, she found herself drawn into a conversation with a group of intellectuals, discussing the latest developments in Confucian philosophy and the principles of governance. It was in this conversation that she first met him, Han Lam. Han Lam was seated at the head of a table, surrounded by a small group of officers who hung on his every word. His eyes were sharp and calculating, yet there was a quiet humility in his demeanor that set him apart from the other powerful men in the room. Zhang Shi was immediately struck by his presence. Not just his physical appearance, but his aura. Something about him seemed different from the typical military men who dominated the political landscape. He exuded confidence, but there was also an air of introspection, as if he was constantly weighing his decisions and their consequences. When the conversation turned to matters of statecraft, Zhang Shi found herself engaging with him directly. First, she was hesitant, unsure of how a man like him might respond to a woman's opinion. But Han Lam, to her surprise, listened intently as she spoke. They discussed the challenges of governing a vast empire, the delicate balance between military power and diplomacy, and the role of wise counsel in shaping imperial policy. Zhang Shi was captivated by his intellect and his genuine interest in her thoughts. It was not long before they found themselves speaking more and more, drawn together by a mutual respect for each other's mind. Over the next several weeks, their paths continued to cross at various gatherings and events. Zhang Shi's reputation as a thoughtful and intelligent woman began to spread, and Han Lam, increasingly impressed by her insight, began to seek her counsel. Their discussions grew deeper, moving from matters of governance to personal philosophy, the burdens of leadership, and the role of honor and duty. Han Lam confided in her about the pressures he faced as a general, the toll that constant war had taken on his spirit, and his longing for peace. Zhang Shi, in turn, shared her thoughts on the nature of leadership. She spoke of the importance of compassion, the strength found in wisdom rather than brute force, and the belief that true power lay not in the ability to command armies, but in the ability to understand and connect with those who served under you. It was during one of these intimate conversations, late one evening as the moon hung high above the city, that Han Lam realized he had found in Zhang Shi not just a brilliant mind, but a kindred spirit. He had spent much of his life surrounded by soldiers and politicians, men who viewed the world through the lens of power and war. But Zhang Shi was different. Her perspective was one of balance, of harmony, and of the long view, principles that he had not considered so deeply until now. And so, over time, their bond grew, from intellectual respect to something more profound. Zhang Shi's influence on Han Lam would become more than just philosophical. It would shape his actions on the battlefield and his decisions at court. But as their relationship deepened, so too did the forces that sought to tear apart the empire they loved. Zhang Shi's early years, though marked by an ordinary beginning, were far from mundane. Growing up in the scholarly heart of Chang'an, she was taught not only the classical Confucian texts that were the foundation of her education, but also the subtle art of diplomacy and politics, as her family's status in the intellectual circles required a degree of social acumen. While most girls of her station were expected to focus on household duties and courtly etiquette, Zhang Shi's sharp mind was nurtured by her father's careful instruction, a privilege granted to few women of the time. Her beauty, though graceful, was never her most notable feature. Instead, It was her intellect and quiet strength that caught the eye of those who truly understood power. In a world dominated by men, Zhang Shi's wit and wisdom were rare commodities, qualities that would later define her role in the life of Han Guo Gong, one of the most legendary military leaders in the Tang Dynasty. It was not a love story that began with sweeping gestures or dramatic moments. It was a slow unfolding of mutual respect, set against the backdrop of an empire at war. Han Guo Gong, or as he was born, Han Lam, had long been known for his military prowess. A young general with unparalleled tactical genius, he had fought in several successful campaigns and quickly risen through the ranks of the Tang military. His reputation as a warrior was solidified after a decisive victory against the forces of the Khitan, a nomadic tribe that threatened the borders of the empire. Though he had many admirers and suitors among the nobility, Han Lam was not interested in love or marriage. His life, for the most part, was consumed by the ambition to expand the Tang Empire's borders and secure his place in history. Yet, fate, as it often does, had other plans. The two first met during a banquet in Chang'an, a gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance, a high-ranking official who saw the potential in fostering an alliance between the Zhang family and Han Guo Gong's. It was during a quiet conversation, rather than an extravagant display of courtly behavior, that Han Lam first recognized the brilliance in Zhang Shi. "I've heard of your father's scholarly works," Han Lam remarked one evening, his gaze fixed on her with unusual intensity. "It is rare to find such wisdom in the daughters of our land." Zhang Shi, who had long grown accustomed to the praise of her father's reputation, simply nodded. "Wisdom is nothing without the ability to act upon it, General," she replied. "A sword, no matter how sharp, must be wielded with understanding." Her words struck Han Lam deeply. In that moment, he realized that Zhang Shi was not simply another noblewoman. She was a mind to be reckoned with, a woman who, in a world dominated by men, had carved her own place. That evening, Han Lam's curiosity about her grew, and what began as a simple conversation soon blossomed into a friendship based on intellectual and emotional respect. For Zhang Shi, the connection was not immediate. She had heard of Han Guo Gong's reputation, his fiery spirit, his ambition, and his prowess in battle. She knew that such men were not typically men of substance or wisdom, yet she could not deny that there was something different about him. Unlike most men she had encountered in the court, he was not consumed by vanity or pride. Instead, there was a quiet determination about him, a focus that intrigued her. Months passed, and their paths crossed more frequently. Over time, Zhang Shi came to understand the complexities of Han Lam's character. He was a man torn between his duty to the empire and his growing disillusionment with the endless cycle of war. He sought victory not for personal gain, but for the stability and future of the Tang Dynasty. It was a vision that Zhang Shi, with her own understanding of the broader political landscape, could appreciate. Their bond grew stronger, and though the palace and the warlords whispered of their union, neither was in a hurry to marry. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and intellectual connection, something more lasting than the fleeting affections of a courtship. It wasn't until the Tang Dynasty was rocked by internal strife and external threats that Zhang Shi and Han Guo Gong found themselves at a crossroads. The emperor, aware of Han Lam's loyalty and skill, summoned him to the battlefield once more, this time to lead a campaign against the powerful forces of the Turkic Khaganate. The stakes were higher than ever, and the war would demand all of Han Lam's skill and leadership. Zhang Shi, now more deeply entrenched in her understanding of statecraft and military affairs, could no longer stay in the background. It was time for her to step forward, not as a passive observer, but as a partner in Han Lam's mission. As the war loomed on the horizon, Zhang Shi found herself faced with a decision. Could she, the quiet scholar, step into the storm that was about to engulf her husband and the empire? Would she remain in Chang'an, her role confined to the walls of their estate? Or would she accompany him on his journey, offering her counsel and wisdom on the battlefield. The answer, she knew, was simple. She had spent too many years watching from the sidelines. Her place was by his side. The winds of war were beginning to stir at the borders of the Tang Empire. Far to the north, the nomadic forces of the Turkic Khaganate were mounting a series of incursions into the empire's territories, threatening to unravel the fragile peace that had been established after the reign of Emperor Taizong. The call for military leadership went out, and generals, both seasoned and young, eagerly responded. Among them was Han Lam, known to the people as Han Guo Gong, a rising star in the military ranks of the Tang Dynasty. Han Lam, born into a family of warriors, had always been destined for a life in the military. His early years were marked by a fierce determination to prove himself. His martial prowess, tactical brilliance, and unyielding courage in battle made him a natural leader. But it was his honor and sense of duty that truly set him apart, qualities that Zhang Shi would come to admire deeply. Their first meeting occurred at a banquet hosted by Zhang Shi's father, who, though a scholar, was well connected among the elite of Chang'an. The event was a gathering of military and political figures, a place where alliances were formed and fortunes made. Zhang Shi was still in her late teens, poised and composed, having spent much of her life in the background of such affairs. She had heard rumors of Han Lam, the young general who had gained a reputation for both his battlefield brilliance and his deep sense of justice. When their eyes met across the room, there was no immediate spark, no grand declaration of love. Instead, it was an exchange of knowing glances, a silent acknowledgement between two souls who had already begun to understand one another without words. Han Lam, in the midst of conversations about the growing threat to the empire, noticed the young woman observing him with a calm, steady gaze. In a world full of political scheming and power plays, Zhang Shi's quiet presence was a stark contrast. It was not long before their conversation turned from polite formalities to more meaningful exchanges. Zhang Shi, well-versed in the strategies of diplomacy, subtly guided the conversation to topics of governance, military strategy, and the moral responsibilities of a ruler. Han Lam, intrigued by her intellect and poise, found himself captivated not by her beauty, but by the sharpness of her mind. As the night drew to a close, Han Lam found himself deep in thought. He had encountered many women in his life, but none who had challenged him intellectually in such a way. Zhang Shi, for her part, had not expected the conversation to leave such a lasting impression on her. She had met generals and statesmen before, but there was something about Han Lam, his seriousness, his commitment to his people, that resonated with her deeply. The days passed, and the war with the Khaganate escalated. Han Lam was called away to the front lines, where he would prove his worth in the heat of battle. Zhang Shi, however, remained in Chang'an, where her role in the social and intellectual circles of the capital continued to grow. Yet, in the quiet moments, her thoughts often wandered back to the general. The memory of their conversation lingered in her mind, and though their worlds seemed so different, she couldn't shake the feeling that their paths were somehow destined to cross again. Months later, as the conflict between the Tang Empire and the Turkic forces reached its peak, Han Lam sent word to Zhang Shi's family. He had been promoted to a higher rank and had earned the title of Han Guo Gong, Prince of Han, a recognition of his military prowess and his loyalty to the emperor. The message was simple, but its implications were clear. Han Lam sought her hand in marriage. Zhang Shi was taken aback. She had always known that her marriage would be one of strategy, a union that would further her family's status. But this was different. Her mind had already begun to drift toward the idea of partnership, of finding someone who shared her values and her vision for the future of the empire. And now, the man she had admired from afar, whose intellect and honor had captivated her, was asking for her to become his wife. Her father, ever the diplomat, saw the strategic importance of the match. Han Lam's rise in the military could only strengthen their family's position. but he also saw the potential for a union based on respect and mutual understanding. For Zhang Shi, the decision was not an easy one. She had been raised to value intellect and independence, and the prospect of marriage, even one as promising as this, was a daunting thought, but she also understood that duty to her family, to her empire, was paramount. The wedding was arranged with little fanfare, a quiet ceremony that reflected the understated elegance of Zhang Shi's character. The day of the marriage, as she stood by Han Lam's side, she realized that this would not be a life of passive obedience. She was not simply a wife. She was a partner. Her role, though not always visible, would be just as important as his. Han Lam, now Han Guo Gong, would need her intellect, her counsel, and her strength as much as he would need his soldiers on the battlefield. And so, as the Tang Empire faced the tumultuous storms of war, Zhang Shi found herself embarking on a new chapter of her life. The woman who had once been content to observe from the sidelines was now poised to take a central role in the fate of an empire. The day Han Guo Gong first laid eyes on Zhang Shi was a quiet one, overshadowed by the political undertones of the banquet. The hall, filled with scholars, noblemen, and military leaders, buzzed with polite conversation. But Han Lam, then a rising star in the military, paid little attention to the glittering guests. He was a man driven by duty, focused on the task at hand, defending the empire from the looming threat of the Turkic Khaganate. Yet, there was something about Zhang Shi that drew his attention, a quiet elegance that matched her sharp mind, a strength of character that was hard to ignore. It wasn't her beauty that caught him, though she was indeed striking. It was the way she spoke, her words carefully chosen, yet delivered with such authority that Han Lam found himself drawn into her thoughts, as though she understood the complexities of leadership in a way few others did. They talked about the empire, about the nature of warfare, and about the shifting alliances that threatened to undermine the peace Emperor Taizong had worked so hard to secure. Zhang Shi, though still young, had a profound understanding of the delicate balance between power and diplomacy. She spoke with a depth that made even the most seasoned generals listen closely, her words carrying an undercurrent of wisdom that transcended her age. Han Lam, impressed by her insight, found himself compelled to engage with her more. It was not romantic attraction at first, but rather a deep intellectual connection, a meeting of minds that neither had expected but both would come to treasure. The conversation shifted when Han Lam revealed his upcoming deployment to the northern front. The Turkic Khaganate had crossed the border, and the Tang Empire needed strong leaders to push them back. Zhang Shi listened intently, offering strategic suggestions of her own. Her thoughts on fortifications, troop movements, and logistics were not only intelligent but grounded in practical experience, something rarely seen in women of her time. "It is not just strength that wins wars," she said thoughtfully. "It is understanding the enemy, knowing where they will strike and where they will not. The Tang have many soldiers, but the key will lie in how we deploy them, how we make them think we are weak when we are strong." Her words stayed with him long after the banquet. Han Lam, though surrounded by trusted advisors and veteran generals, could not shake the feeling that Zhang Shi had seen something that others had missed. She understood the art of warfare, not in terms of brute force, but in strategy, psychology, and patience. As weeks passed, Zhang Shi and Han Lam found themselves crossing paths more frequently. She, always in the background at court, would quietly offer counsel to her father's colleagues, earning their respect through the subtlety and wisdom of her words. Han Lam, now preparing for the campaign, would occasionally seek her out. Their conversations grew longer, more frequent, and more personal. He shared his fears about the war, about the uncertainty of victory, and the heavy burden of leadership. In return, she offered him a steady presence, someone who could remind him of the larger purpose of his mission, someone who saw beyond the battlefield to the future of the empire. But Han Lam was not the only one called to action. Zhang Shi, despite her sheltered life, was no stranger to hardship. She had witnessed the turbulence of the empire's political landscape, the rise and fall of influential families, and the way power could be both a blessing and a curse. She knew that a marriage to a man of Han Lam's stature would not simply be a union of love. It would be a partnership of equal strength, of mutual understanding and shared ambition. As the general prepared to leave for the northern front, Zhang Shi found herself standing at a precipice. The world of the court, of literature, and philosophy that she had known all her life was about to be replaced by a different world. One of military strategy, bloodshed, and the harsh realities of war. "I cannot promise that I will return," Han Lam said one evening, as they stood beneath the moonlight in the garden of her family's home. "But I can promise that I will fight for the empire, and for a future where my children will live in peace." Zhang Shi, gazing at the stars, knew the weight of his words. "And I will fight for that future too," she said softly, "in my own way." Though their marriage had not yet been formalized, there was an unspoken understanding between them that their paths were now intertwined. Zhang Shi would remain in Chang'an, supporting his efforts from afar, while Han Lam would lead his forces against the Turkic threat. Driven by the promise of a brighter future for the empire, the campaign would take months. Han Lam led his men across treacherous terrain, battling not only the Turkic invaders but also the weather, hunger, and the fierce pride of his own soldiers. His tactical brilliance, refined by the counsel of Zhang Shi's quiet wisdom, helped turn the tide in several key engagements. Word of his victories spread, and with each victory, the name Han Lam became synonymous with honor and valor. Yet, as the war raged on, Zhang Shi remained a steady presence in the capital, supporting not only her father's scholarly endeavors but also engaging in quiet acts of diplomacy. She used her influence among the court's intellectual circles to ensure that the empire's leaders remained focused on the greater good, avoiding the temptations of power struggles that could undermine the Tang Dynasty's unity. In the quiet moments, when she received letters from Han Lam detailing his campaigns, Zhang Shi would sit by the window, her heart torn between the pride she felt for him and the fear that gnawed at her soul. She knew that every battle he fought brought him closer to the heart of danger, and every victory he achieved brought him further from her. But through it all, Zhang Shi remained steadfast. She was the calm in the storm, the steady hand behind the scenes, making sure that the empire did not falter while its most trusted general fought on its behalf. Months passed since that fateful night at the banquet, and though Guo Gong and Zhang Shi had barely exchanged more than a few words, there was an undeniable connection between them. It was not love at first sight, but rather a deep respect that grew with time, grounded in shared ideals and mutual understanding. For Han Lam, a man whose life was consumed by the military and the defense of the Tang Empire, it was a rare moment of solace to find someone who truly grasped the weight of his responsibilities. For Zhang Shi, who had been raised in the intellectual and political circles of Chang'an, Han Lam represented the complex reality of the world she had been raised to navigate. She saw beyond his title of general and recognized the burden of leadership he carried, the sacrifices he made for the empire, and the toll it took on his heart. She also recognized the sharpness of his mind, his unspoken vulnerability, traits that mirrored her own in many ways. Their conversations, initially centered around matters of state and the ever-looming threat of the Turkic Khaganate, soon expanded into more personal realms. They spoke of their childhoods, their families, and their hopes for the future. Han Lam, though fiercely private and reserved, began to open up to Zhang Shi in a way he had never done with anyone else. He found himself confiding in her about his fears, his doubts, and the burden of his role as a military leader in a time of constant war. Zhang Shi, in turn, admired his honesty, his sense of duty, and his unwavering commitment to the empire. Yet, she also saw the weight of the life he had chosen. His world was one of bloodshed and sacrifice, a world that demanded everything from him. It was a world she had grown to understand, but one she could never fully embrace. And so, despite the growing affection between them, Zhang Shi knew that her place was not on the battlefield alongside him. Her destiny, she believed, was to be his partner in a different way, to offer counsel, support, and, perhaps most importantly, a grounding presence in a life that was defined by chaos and uncertainty. The pivotal moment in their relationship came one autumn evening when Han Lam received word that the emperor had called for him. The threat from the Turkic Khaganate had escalated, and it was clear that the Tang Empire needed its most capable generals to lead a decisive campaign. Han Lam, who had already proven his worth in earlier battles, was tasked with leading the charge to protect the empire's northern frontier. Zhang Shi, ever the pragmatist, understood the gravity of the situation. She knew that this campaign could be the beginning of something much larger, an all-out war that could determine the future of the Tang Dynasty. As Han Lam prepared to leave, she took him aside, her words calm but firm. "You must return safely," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "This empire needs you, the people need you, but more than that, I need you." Han Lam, who had never been one to show much emotion, found himself moved by her words. It was the first time someone had spoken to him not as a general, but as a man. He could see the deep concern in her eyes, the strength that lay behind her gentle demeanor. He knew that she had always understood the cost of war, but this moment made him realize that she also understood the cost of his choices, his sacrifices. "I will return," he promised, his voice low and sincere. "And when I do, I will make sure you are by my side. We have yet to see the world as it should be." Zhang Shi. As the days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, Zhang Shi was left to wait. She returned to her family home in Chang'an, but her mind was never at ease. Her thoughts constantly wandered to Han Lam, his safety, his well-being, and the future they could build together. The Turkic Khaganate's forces were formidable, and despite the strength of the Tang military, the war was far from certain. Zhang Shi poured her energy into her work, advising her father and other scholars in the court, but her heart remained heavy. Then, one cold winter morning, news arrived. Han Lam had won a decisive victory against the Turkic forces. He had led his troops with unparalleled skill, securing the frontier and protecting the empire from a major threat. But the victory came at a high cost. Han Lam had been injured in battle, severely wounded, but he had insisted on leading the charge. Even in his weakened state, when Zhang Shi heard of his injuries, a wave of both relief and fear washed over her. She knew that his survival meant the continued safety of the empire, but she also knew the toll it would take on him. She made her way to the military camp, her heart beating fast as she neared the place where Han Lam was being cared for. When she arrived, she found him lying in a modest tent, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes still holding the same strength that had first captivated her. Despite his injuries, there was something about him, something in his presence, that made her feel both at ease and yet, somehow, afraid. She approached him quietly, sitting by his side. "You are alive," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That is all that matters." Han Lam reached for her hand, his grip weak but steady. "I promised you I would return. I keep my word." And in that moment, as they sat together in the quiet of the camp, Zhang Shi knew that their destinies were now irrevocably tied. The world they had known, one of political intrigue and military conflict, would continue to shape their lives. But she also understood that, in this moment, surrounded by the chaos of war, they had found something enduring, a bond forged in the fires of battle, a bond that would carry them through the challenges to come. The winds of change swept across the Tang Empire as the military campaigns in the north continued to intensify. Han Guo Gong, having proven himself as a brilliant strategist and fierce warrior, was now called upon to lead a critical campaign against the Turkic Khaganate, whose raids had grown bolder and more frequent. The very survival of the empire seemed to hang in the balance. and with it, the fate of its leaders. But for Han Lam, the threat of war was not the only battle he faced. As he prepared for the long march to the northern front, Zhang Shi found herself caught in a world that was both foreign and familiar. The quiet, intellectual conversations she had once shared with Han Lam had transformed into something more. The man she had come to respect had become someone she deeply cared for. And though their love had not yet been spoken, it was understood in the silences they shared and the glances exchanged between them. Zhang Shi knew the life of a soldier's wife, often lonely, always uncertain, but there was a calm strength in her heart. She had long understood that the role of the general was not one of ease or stability. War had a way of drawing out the best and worst of men. And for Han Lam, she knew it would be no different. He was a man driven by honor and duty, a man who saw beyond the battlefield to the future of the empire. Yet she also knew the sacrifices war demanded, not just of soldiers, but of those who waited at home. As the day of his departure drew near, Zhang Shi made her way to the outskirts of Chang'an, where Han Lam had set up camp before embarking on his northern journey. The early morning mist hung in the air, casting an ethereal glow over the fields. The quiet of the morning seemed to mirror the unease in her heart. She had grown used to the world of politics and strategy, but now, standing before the man she had come to love, it was different. She was not a daughter of scholars or a diplomat. She was simply a woman whose heart ached at the thought of losing the man she cared for. Han Lam stood at the edge of the camp, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun, a symbol of strength and resolve. But when his eyes met hers, there was a moment of softness, an understanding that passed between them in silence. "You've always been the one who understood," Han Lam said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his impending departure. "This war is not just a fight for the empire, Zhang Shi. It is a fight for the future we both envision, a future where peace prevails. But there is always the chance that I may not return." Zhang Shi stepped forward, her voice steady, though her heart trembled. "And if you do not return, what then? Will the empire fall without your leadership?" Han Lam shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "The empire will not fall. There are many brave men, many leaders, but it is you I fear losing. You are the foundation I stand upon." Her eyes softened, the unsaid words between them growing clearer. There was no need for grand declarations. They both understood the enormity of what lay ahead. Zhang Shi reached out, taking his hand, a silent promise of strength and loyalty, of faith in the bond they had forged. "Come back to me," she whispered, and with that, Han Lam mounted his horse and led his troops into the northern frontier, leaving behind the woman who had captured his heart not with extravagant gestures, but with the quiet power of understanding and love. Years passed, and the wars that had defined so much of Han Guo Gong's life began to fade into history. The threat from the Turkic Khaganate was finally subdued, and the empire began to enjoy a period of relative peace. But for those who had lived through the bloodshed and sacrifice, the memories lingered, shaping the future in ways both subtle and profound. Zhang Shi, who had once been a young woman caught in the tides of war and politics, had become something much more, a cornerstone of Han Guo Gong's legacy. Her wisdom, loyalty, and unshakable support had not only helped him through the darkest days of battle, but had also guided him through the tumultuous years of political intrigue that followed. When Han Guo Gong returned from his final campaign, victorious but weary, it was not the cheers of soldiers or the formalities of the court that mattered to him most. It was the quiet moments shared with Zhang Shi, the calm understanding between them that gave him peace. In the years that followed, they built a life together in the capital, not one of luxury or extravagance, but of mutual respect and quiet companionship. Zhang Shi had never sought fame or glory. She was not a woman who craved attention or public admiration. Her legacy was not written in the annals of history through grand speeches or triumphs on the battlefield, but in the strength she offered Han Lam when the weight of the empire threatened to crush him. in the wisdom she shared that shaped his decisions, and in the quiet, steady love she provided through every storm they faced. As Han Guo Gong grew older, his health began to fail him. The toll of war, the endless campaigns, and the burdens of leadership had taken their toll. Yet, he remained a man of great honor, respected by his peers and feared by his enemies. He was a symbol of strength and resilience, not just in battle, but in life. But even the mightiest warriors must one day lay down their swords. In his final days, it was Zhang Shi who remained at his side. She was there when his strength faltered, when his mind wandered through memories of battles long past, and when the weight of the years seemed too much to bear. She held his hand as he spoke softly of the empire they had fought for, of the future they had dreamed of, and of the love they had shared in silence for so many years. "Zhang Shi," he whispered, his voice hoarse but filled with gratitude. "I would not have been the man I am without you. You were the strength behind every victory, the calm in every storm. I am forever in your debt." She smiled gently, her heart heavy with the years they had shared. "It was never about victory, my love. It was always about ensuring that you remained true to yourself, no matter the cost." Han Guo Gong passed away quietly, surrounded by those who loved him, but it was Zhang Shi who carried his legacy forward. In the years that followed his death, she continued to serve the empire, using her wisdom to guide the next generation of leaders. Her influence, though quiet, was felt in the corridors of power, where her counsel was sought by those who understood the value of a steady hand. Zhang Shi's story was not one of grand battles or imperial power. It was the story of a woman who understood that true strength lay not in the sword, but in the heart. She had been a silent force, a quiet strength that had shaped the course of history in ways no one could fully understand. In her, the Tang Dynasty had seen not just a wife and a mother, but a true partner, whose unwavering loyalty and wisdom had helped guide one of its greatest generals through the darkest of times. As the years turned to centuries, Zhang Shi's name faded from the public memory, overshadowed by the great generals and emperors who had shaped the course of the Tang Empire. Yet, in the hearts of those who truly knew the cost of war, her legacy lived on, a reminder that behind every great leader is a quiet strength, often unseen, but always vital. And so, the story of Zhang Shi and Han Guo Gong came to an end, not in the noise of battle, but in the peace of a life well lived, a legacy quietly passed down through the generations, ever enduring in the silent strength of those who came after.